Thank you very much. All right, thank you everyone, and thank you for having me, and thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to pull up the slides myself, so I am in line with Jared over here. So yes, move the mic lower. Sure. I am vertically challenged. I'm sure some of you are are also vertically challenged. So again, thank you for having me. Thank you for joining us. Today we will be speaking about the ethical garden and how native plants are going to be the solution for a greener future for ourselves and also the rest of the planet. Okay, so you can go to the next slide, Jared. So here is just, let's start about the problems that we're facing on the planet, and that is deforestation is one of them. It's a big issue. So this is a photo of Borneo, and this is most likely deforestation in efforts to grow out palm oil plantations. So if you enjoy peanut butter, or if you're someone who does check the ingredients of the food that you eat, check to make sure you're not eating palm oil, because it is very destructive how it is grown, and it is responsible for the loss of thousands of acres and hectares of habitat in Southeast Asia and also in South America. So just to show you how much of the earth is no longer of quality habitat anymore, we're about 20 to 40% of the earth is still relatively intact, but of course we need to be doing more to prevent that from deteriorating further. If you go to the next slide, please, Jared. So just looking at Long Island, you can see how densely populated just Long Island is. The town of Hempstead, for example, is the most populated township in all of America. We have a very, very high population density, which you can see from the diagram here. And the reason this is an issue is because, not only is this map showing how many people are living in that area, but it's a pretty good example of also what the ground looks like in these areas. So anything that's blue on this map is most likely covered in mostly concrete or asphalt. That is roadways, that is parking lots, that is shopping centers, that is people's homes. Yes, there are some front lawns here and there, but if you were to ever zoom in on a satellite view of Long Island, you would see that most maps consider most of Nassau County as an urban area, even though we are not technically urban and such as like New York City, but we have such a degree of development that has occurred especially in Nassau County, that at this point it is an urban environment. Issues that are caused by that, of course, is just lack of habitat, where there is no physical habitat for wildlife, but also, if I'm sure none of you have been living under a rock, but the main other issues is stormwater issues, where we have runoff, where there is no soil for the rainwater to percolate through and to filter through. So what we end up happening is any pollution that's lining our parking lots, which the parking lot here is a great example where you guys have created a beautiful rain garden to deal with the flooding of your own parking lot, and that helps remediate any issues that might happen with stormwater runoff. So in your own garden, your parking lot, it rains, any dust or debris, washes away, but it ends up in your recessed rain garden. And then it percolates through the soil, and that recharges the water table. It prevents that runoff that's filled with pollutants from then going into our storm drains, which then go directly to our bays. So besides the pollution being an issue with our bays, just the abundance of fresh water influxing every time we have a rain event, because naturally that rainwater would not just end up in our estuaries, they would naturally percolate through the soil. So by creating rain gardens and doing curb cuts and things that you've already implemented at the Ethical Society on Long Island, you can remediate those issues, pretty much anywhere. There's great implementation happening in Nassau County now. Nassau Soil, County and Water actually has a grant right now for permeable pavers for commercial properties. So I'm very happy to see that's happening as well. So that there's just many things that this urbanization, urban heat effect is another one, where you have all of this asphalt, dark roofs, and lack of transpiration and evaporation happening throughout the day, which tends to heat up our environment as well, which then causes more issues later on throughout the year. Next slide, please. So this past year, I was happy to see that the UN seems to have finally agreed on something, which is that we need to preserve at least a third of the planet. If we are going to survive as a civilization, a global civilization, we have to preserve at least a third of the planet. There are plenty of organizations and people who think we need to preserve more. I'm one of those people. But this is a great start. We're acknowledging that there is a problem and that we are coming up with solutions to meet that problem. There are plenty of large-scale applications and solutions that the UN will be dealing with, but today we're going to talk about a little smaller solution at home that you can deal with, or even on a facility like this that we're visiting today. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering how this relates to native plants. So native plants are the solution, and that is because we've just discussed we have overdevelopment, we have invasive species, which I'll get into later, climate change, and pollution. So typical landscapes where you just have typical front lawns, backyards to just lawn from property line to property line, they're very resource intensive. You need lots of petroleum-based resources in order to upkeep these plantings. So whether it is the gasoline that's powering the mowers, or whether it's the petroleum-based fertilizers or pesticides that are used to keep them green and keep them growing and keep them looking lush, those chemicals, you can omit those altogether by utilizing native plants and gardening smart and landscaping smart. So if you look here at this little graphic here, just mowing your lawn for an hour is equivalent to driving 300 miles, which is from LA to Las Vegas. So that is a big issue, because you can just imagine how many lawnmowers are going at any given time, even just in Nassau County during the growing season. Native plants, they don't need to be mowed like that. If you are mowing a native planting, such as a meadow or prairie, it would typically be done once or twice a year. It wouldn't be done weekly. So you're saving yourself a lot of emissions, which is the leading cause of global warming is carbon dioxide emissions. Courtesy of human beings, of course. And then also, there's also a ton of petroleum that is spilt in the process of filling up these landscaping machineries. You know, it happens. It's no one's doing it on purpose, but plenty of oil and plenty of gasoline ends up in the environment just accidentally as well. Invasive species are a big issue. These are species, both plants and animals, that have been translocated due to human activities, sometimes on purpose, sometimes accidentally. You may have seen the latest species that's taking the media by storm is the spotted lanternfly in the last couple of years. They have spread into New York and Long Island recently. Last year, especially, you might have even observed them yourself in your own garden or just around town. New York City, they were all over the sidewalk, they were up buildings, they were all over social media. So invasive species, they negatively affect our ecosystem, and they also negatively affect our economy. So spotted lanternfly right now doesn't seem like it's really going to be an issue ecologically, but we're very worried that it's going to be an issue economically because it may affect many of our agricultural crops, such as wine, so wine grapes, I'm sorry, and some other agricultural fruit crops as well. Next slide, please. So native plants are special because no matter where you are on the planet, they are the foundation of the food web. So insects, they're specific to their native plants. So this is a beautiful photo here of everyone's favorite butterfly, monarch butterfly caterpillar on some milkweed. They require species, this particular insect requires species within the milkweed genus in order to successfully raise its young. So they may nectar on foreign plants. You can plant out a butterfly garden filled with non-native exotic flowering plants, and you may see hummingbirds, you may see butterflies drinking from those flowers, but you will never increase the population of butterflies by planting out non-native plants, and that is because they require those native plants as their host species. That goes for many other native species of insects as well. So whether it's a cricket or whether it's a caterpillar, and whether that caterpillar turns into a moth or a butterfly, doesn't really matter. They all require their respective host plants. Many species don't require just one. They have a broad selection to choose from, but that's why it's important to have a high amount of diversity in the landscape and to include as many appropriate native species as you can in such a planting. There are also an added benefit of native plants is if you're in deer country or if you have rabbits, they are resistant to such things as rabbit browse and deer browse. You may need to, protect some things while they're young, but for the most part, you're not going to be upset because the deer ate all your hostas. Like I have many people complain that the deer ate their hostas and they want to grow their hostas, but they can't. So again, hostas are not native, but perhaps replacing those hostas with something that is more deer tolerant or even toxic so that the deer don't eat it would be a better option, and then it would have the added benefit of not only beautifying your yard, but also providing habitat and resources for wildlife. So also there is a lower long-term maintenance cost. So when you are planting with native plants and designing with native plants and gardening with native plants, we just discussed how resource intensive the alternative is. So compared to a typical lawn, monoculture lawn, you're going to be spending a lot less resources and a lot less money in the long term trying to establish and then maintain and manage a native planting versus if you were to continue to grow a non-native turfgrass species or some sort of ornamental garden that is planted out with non-native exotic species. Next slide, please. Just a little close-up again of a monocaterpillar feeding on milkweed, just to show you the genius of nature. You can see where the caterpillar, the leaf has that really sharp angle on it right there where the stem is, it looks like it was broken and snapped down. That is because the caterpillar did actually do that. So before the caterpillar consumes the leaf, they actually cut off the supply of the sap, of the latex sap. So milkweeds are known as milkweeds because they have a milky latex sap. That is why this caterpillar is such brightly colored and has such contrast in it, and that's why monarch butterflies also have that contrast of those bright oranges on black to tell predators or potential predators that they are bitter, because what they do is they absorb all of these bitter compounds, these toxic compounds from their host species, repurpose it inside their own body, and that prevents them from being consumed later on in life. The caterpillar, if it did not cut that stem, would gunk its mouth up. It would be completely clogged with latex, it would dry up and have trouble feeding. So there's a little bit of genius in the evolution here where the actual caterpillars know, or whether it's instinctual or whether it's a thought process, I don't think we can prove right now, but the caterpillar knows to do that before it starts feeding. Next slide, please. So here's another photo of some showy milkweed with a black swallowtail butterfly. So this is a completely different species of butterfly, just to show how just one species can support more than, just one species of native plant can support different species of insects within your garden. So while this butterfly does not host on this plant as a caterpillar, it will nectar from the species. We'll show you some photos of what they need to nectar on later on in the slide. Continue, please. So native plants, once you start gardening with native plants, they start providing wildlife with food, shelter, places to raise young, and if you're maintaining your native plant properly, or if you're going that extra step to exclude the machinery from your gardens, you will also be providing a safe refuge from noise, that other sorts of pollution with the air pollution, and then also you can go that extra step and limit your light pollution as well as pesticides. Pesticides really have no place in a native planting regarding for bugs. So some people don't like bugs, but just know that as you're gardening for insects, you are increasing the beneficial insects, but also the beneficial wildlife that will consume the pest species. So by starting at the bottom and supporting the food chain directly from the bottom, it has a stronger foundation, and you will see a balance. It may take a year or two, but you will see a balance of predatory insects and songbirds and other animals that will come in and handle any pest species that you might be dealing with. Next slide, please. So just to recap, native plants do provide food, shelter, and places to raise young for wildlife. So instead of us developing over quality prime habitat, we can be supplying that habitat right at home, right outside our front door. Next slide, please. So here's just a nice little chart. This is courtesy of Doug Tallamy. If anyone would like to read something to get really a great understanding of the native plant movement, he is the man who wrote the book on this, literally, multiple books. So Doug Tallamy is a professor. He's actually an entomologist, not a botanist. But he studies the relationship between native plants and insects. And furthermore, he studies where those insects then end up, which is hopefully in the belly of a native songbird. So if you look here, the top of the list is oaks, willows, and cherries. Oaks, cherries, and willows, I should say. And you can see that the oaks host over 500 different species of insects. So that's very important, and that is because songbirds in particular feed their chicks almost exclusively soft-bodied insects. And by soft-bodied insects, we're talking about caterpillars. So by having native oaks in the environment, Garden City is wonderful. It's a Tree City, USA. They have a great canopy of native oak trees and other native trees providing shade and habitat. The maintenance of it is a little bit of an issue because we end up removing those leaves, which many of these caterpillars overwinter in. So that's one issue that the village needs a little bit of a help if we're going to focus on creating habitat for insects like that. But it's a great example just to show you just the differing amounts of insects that are hosted by our individual native tree species. So the top three, like I said, is oaks, willows, and cherries. But if you look at the bottom, there's like the Kentucky coffee tree down at the bottom. That is native to the southeastern United States. It's just starting to make its way up here, both because, you know, natural migration, but also human-assisted migration. And you can see it only hosts about 3 species of insect. So that's a good example of, even just in North America, taking a tree from a different region of the country is not going to support nearly as much insects and not have nearly as much ecological function in the environment as something like an oak, cherry, or a willow. Even a pine tree. Long Island has a lot of pine trees. Those are also great for the landscape for ecological purposes. If you could just, next slide, please. This is just a nice little photo of a gray catbird in a wild black cherry tree. So there are a couple wild black cherry trees in the back here, which I made sure to, when we were doing our initial consultation with the Ethical Humanist Society, to preserve those as much as possible. And that was because they were naturally here. Most likely they were deposited in the droppings of a bird, grew into trees, and this is the result. You have songbirds, native songbirds, that are able to easily find insects, caterpillars, to feed themselves and also their chicks, to successfully raise their chicks each year. So this photo is actually taken in Queens, in the maritime forest along Jamaica Bay. My friend Carl took this photo. It's just a beautiful representation of how important cherry trees are. Besides hosting caterpillars for the songbird to eat, cherries also are a very early season bloomer. So they bloom April, early May, before the leaves really come out on the trees. Great for early season pollinators that are emerging, bumblebees, other sorts of native bees, orchard bees, ground nesting bees, mason bees. And then in late summer, those flowers ripen into fruit. So wild black cherry, the flavor everybody knows is wild black cherry, is this tree. You can actually buy wild black cherry juice. A couple brands actually make it a point that it's wild black cherry and not the typical tart cherry or sweet cherry that's from Europe. Makes great pie, it makes great jelly, it makes great jello even. But also the birds eat it. So it's great all around for wildlife. You get the pollination, you get the insect hosting capabilities, and you get the fruit that's supporting wildlife pretty much all through the year until the middle point of wintertime. Next slide, please. It's very important to know what is native to your area. So if you are able to look closely, I did pinpoint where we are on the map. It says Garden City, but it is actually the pinpoint for the Ethical Humanist Society on Long Island. There are 3 main ecoregions on Long Island, and that's the Long Island Sound Coastal Lowland, the Cape Cod Long Island Complex, which really extends from, that's like the Pine Barrens region that extends from New Jersey through Long Island into Cape Cod. And then we have the Barrier Island Coastal Marsh Complex, which is all on the South Shore, maritime grasslands, marshes, different Barrier Island communities. And it just helps to know where you are on the island and then what what plant communities are really going to occupy those spaces. So we can't make the decision of what we should be restoring and what we should be including in our gardens unless we know where we're coming from and the history of the land that we're on. And speaking of ethics, because that is the main focus today, a lot of what we're doing to a certain extent is also decolonizing the island. So we're decolonizing the island, 400, 500, 600 years of European colonization has left this island completely different than what it would have looked like when European settlers first arrived. So it helps to know what ecoregion we're in. It helps to know what plant communities we are going to be mimicking and to be modeling our gardens after. And this is a great diagram. This is from the New York Natural History Program. They have a great website. They have a great database. You can go online and research plants and also communities through the New York Natural History Program. It's a fantastic website. Next slide, please. So a great design tip that I like to provide, again, is to mimic what your plant community naturally would have been. Yes, your soil is going to be different than what it should be. You can do soil testing. You can figure out exactly, if your soil is close enough to what it should have been. But really, I like to let my customers and my clients, I like to teach them what should have been here. So where we are right now, I highlighted for us, is the Hempstead Plains. So Hempstead Plains is probably our most critically endangered ecosystem on the island. It's one of the most critically endangered ecosystems on the planet. There's less than 1% left of the Hempstead Plains. The only bit of official Hempstead Plains left, there are fragments here and there, but the only preserved and protected and managed parcel of Hempstead Plains left is along Nassau Community. It's next to Nassau Community College. It's maintained by the Friends of Hempstead Plains, and they actually now have expanded that into the Purcell Preserve, which is a Nassau County nature preserve across the street, which they have gone in, started removing trees that don't belong there, started mowing again and getting all the litter out and all the, fixing all the dirt bike paths and ATV pathways that have been scouring the preserve while it's been closed over the past couple decades, and restoring it. So it really helps to know exactly where you are. I know a lot of people, especially in central Nassau County, especially after Sandy, are nervous about planting large trees, and I don't blame you. We did mention how oak trees are probably the most wildlife friendly and most productive tree you can plant. But if you're nervous about planting a large oak tree on your property, we do actually have 2 dwarf oak trees that are shrub species that you can plant out on your property. And they will function just as well ecologically. They will host just as many caterpillars. They will feed just as much wildlife with their acorns. They may not shelter as much wildlife, but you'll still get the hosting capabilities out of them. So central Nassau County, if you don't want to plant trees and you're scared of planting trees, model your garden after the Hempstead Plains. Do a tall grass prairie. Do a short grass meadow planting. There are other options besides reforesting we didn't have forest everywhere from sea to shining sea. We had a varying diversity of communities on Long Island, and you have your options to choose from depending on where you are on the island. Next slide, please. So the benefit of planting with native plants for wildlife is no matter which angle you're coming from. I know a lot of people get started with butterflies. I know a lot of children get started with butterflies just because they're colorful. They don't seem to scare as many people as some other wildlife. But if you're gardening for pollinators, you're gardening for butterflies, you end up supporting higher life forms. So once you're gardening for butterflies and you're providing those host plants, you're providing those nectar species, you're going to be also supporting songbirds, because the songbirds will come in, they will eat the caterpillars. The songbirds will also come in and they will eat the seeds that your nectaring plants will ripen into. Additionally, if you're doing a pollinator garden, you're going to support butterflies, because while butterflies aren't necessarily great pollinators, they will still come in and nectar on your plants and feed on your plants and host on your plants. So even though you're focusing on a particular set of wildlife, you're going to still manage to support other species such as box turtles, bats, chipmunks, rabbits, foxes. I'm sure you saw the coyote in New Hyde Park a couple days ago. So they're getting very close now to us. The golf course actually would probably be a great habitat for a coyote to live in without anyone even knowing they're ever there. For all you know, there could be a coyote living here and we wouldn't even know. So by creating these native habitats, creating these native plant gardens, you're actually supporting the ecosystem, and so you're creating all this habitat for all of these species, even though you only may be focusing on maybe pollinators or maybe butterflies. Continue, please. One more slide. Just some backyard wildlife from some of my members on Facebook group. So this is a photo of her yard beforehand, and really all she did here was create a nice little border of some switchgrass, and she changed the way she maintained her property as well. So she doesn't completely clean up the leaves anymore. She takes them off the lawn, but she puts them in her beds for the native plant gardens. And you see here that the wild turkeys are coming in and not only feeding on the seeds, but also rummaging through and foraging through the leaf litter to find insects, to find seeds, to find small animals like maybe salamanders or even mice. So this is just a great example of how just doing one simple change can have far-reaching benefits for wildlife in the neighborhood. Continue. So this is a photo from my own garden. This is a black-capped chickadee nest box with a chick in it. So Doug Tallamy in his books focuses a lot on chickadees. I think they're just easier to study since they do readily go to nest boxes. But one of his main focuses in his original book was on the fact that if a chickadee is raising chicks and it's surrounded by non-native tree species in a typical suburban neighborhood, it struggles to raise those chicks. Where there's native trees in the environment, they are much more likely to successfully raise those chicks than if there were no native trees around or less native trees around, not enough native trees. So he was actually finding that in many situations where there was a lack of native trees and a lack of other native plant species, some of these chicks are actually starving in their garden, in their nest. They just don't have access, the adults don't have access to food, so they just can't feed their chicks. Alternatively, what happens is instead of feeding them caterpillars, which is what they should be eating, they end up falling back on other things. So maybe aphids or maybe crickets, things that are not as easily digestible and that they haven't really evolved to develop on. There's still a lot of research going on in this field about what they should be eating and what's best for them, but what we know now is that soft-bodied insects, the caterpillars, are really what most of our songbirds are feeding on when they're chicks. So that nest is maybe like a coffee cup, like the diameter of a coffee cup. I just like to show this photo because if you look closely at the material that the nest is made out of, most people's properties, especially now, it's spring is here. Even yesterday, the landscapers out doing their spring cleaning. We remove most of these materials from traditionally landscaped properties. So we don't allow leaf litter to hang around. We don't allow twigs and sticks to hang around. We don't allow even the leaf. So there's little needles from arborvitaes mixed in there. So we rake that up, we bag it up, we dispose of it. This one species of bird here has animal hair fibers, has plant material fibers, has leaves from arborvitaes, has mosses, and probably some other things that I'm forgetting that are required for it to make this nest. So it's a holistic approach where not only are we now including native plants, but we're changing how we're maintaining these gardens and we're changing how we're maintaining the land. So it's all about being a good steward of the land, besides also just throwing in native plants in your front garden and hoping everything works well. It's also how we maintain these and how we're making the concerted effort to do it differently and stopping ourselves and saying, do I need to clean up these leaves? What kind of benefit do I get from cleaning up these leaves? And what kind of benefits may happen if I simply just choose not to leave them, not to pick them up and just leave them on the ground? Next slide, please. Actually, wait, let's go back one more before I forget. There you go, perfect. Okay, so I just want to show, this is a nest box, an artificial nest box. The reason this bird is in an artificial nest box is because there are simply no dead trees in the environment. So that's another big thing where, especially in the suburbs, we see a dead tree and we would just want to get rid of it. Not traditionally, but historically, naturally, many of our songbirds, our cavity nesting songbirds, would nest in an abandoned woodpecker. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by the birds out the window here. So they would nest in an abandoned woodpecker hollow. So when we remove these dead, whether it's the actual dead tree itself or just a single branch, whatever it may be, when we remove that from the environment, we really do limit how much habitat is available. Dead wood is very important. I'm probably butchering the saying, but I can't even remember where the saying came from, but there's a saying I really do enjoy, and it's a tree's life is only half over when it dies. And that's because whether that tree is standing vertical and becoming woodpecker, a woodpecker house with holes all over it, which then are occupied by other species of birds, or it's housing fungi, insects that are then eaten by other songbirds and woodpeckers. Dead trees in the environment are very important. So if you are able to keep a log on the ground just as habitat, please do so. If you are able to safely keep a dead snag, if you're able to safely keep a dead branch or snag standing where it's not going to fall on a house or a car or injure somebody, then please consider doing so. Next slide, please. So this is just to show, again, it's how we maintain these properties. It's not just planting out native plants, because again, we can plant out native plants, but if we maintain them the same way with pesticides, with constant, constant cutbacks of deadheading the flowers and cutting things back in late fall, doing that fall cleanup, we're not going to be supporting the insects and the songbirds and the other wildlife that we're trying to support. So at that point, if you're planting out a native garden only for aesthetics and you're still treating it like any other garden, again, that's not very ethical. The point of this is to do what we can to support not only what we want out of our garden, but to also support the wildlife. So you don't want to be deadheading. You don't want to remove the seed heads that these birds rely on through the winter months and through late summer into fall through the winter. You don't want to remove materials, so that the leaves are great nesting material. Opossums will come and actually wrap up a ball of leaves in their tails, bring them back to their homes, and make a nest out of it. Opossums are great for controlling insect pests in the garden. They also don't carry rabies, so it's a great. Opossums are great to have in the garden if you see them. Don't chase them out. But again, it's all about just maintaining the garden, maintaining the land in a way that not only supports and meets the requirements for humans, but also continues to support the wildlife around it. So you may need to go in and remove some invasive species once or twice a year. You may do a cutback just to keep things aesthetically pleasing for us, because if this was a restoration planting that you were creating, and let's say your goldenrod grew to 6 feet tall and it started flopping over as it went to bloom, no one would really care. But if it's your front yard, it may be discerning. You may not like the fact that that's falling over. So at that point, we do recommend people for the taller stuff do a cutback around July 4th of the taller perennials, and that way it's more aesthetically pleasing for us. That actually simulates browsing pressure from wildlife. So in our suburban gardens where we don't have deer, at least right now, we have to step up and simulate some of these pressures that these plants have evolved under. And since this is kind of like a Nassau County unique situation actually too, because other places, even out east in Suffolk County, they have deer. So I have plenty of customers where they plant out their plants and the deer come and do this for them, and they don't have to do a cutback come July 4th. But if you're in Nassau County, you don't have deer, it helps for certain plants to just do a cutback just to keep things from flopping over and keeping things looking aesthetically pleasing for yourself and your neighbors. Next slide, please. So stem nesting bees. This is the time of year where I'm doing my best to tell people to not cut back their plants. So the seeds might have been eaten already, but the plants are not done yet being supportive to insects and wildlife. So you can see here, I did circle one of the stem nesting bees here. This is switchgrass. If you want to see switchgrass and you're here today, there's plenty of it in the rain garden out front. Switchgrass is very important. It's a beautiful ornamental grass. You could see how beautifully it's standing through the winter months. The snow weighs it down for a little if it snows, and it perks right back up. Beautiful tan color through the winter. The sounds of the winds through it is really nice as well, kind of drowns out the traffic a little bit. But what's important about switchgrass and most of the other native perennials that we have is that they have hollow stems. So whether they're completely hollow or they have a pith inside, our stem nesting bees are the ones who need that space and that habitat in order to survive. So this time of year, we go in and we tell people it's time to do the cutback mid to late April. Don't do it yet. It's way too early right now. And that's because these bees are not awake yet. So a lot of our bees, they don't really start moving around until temperatures are steady, 50, 55 for about a week. Then they start really waking up. And then what we do here is we cut them back. We leave about 12 to 24 inches. I like to leave a little more. It's my personal preference. And these bees go in, they lay an egg, they seal it off, they lay an egg, they seal it off, they lay an egg and seal it off. And those eggs and those larvae take 365 days to develop into an adult. So that's why it's so important where, you leave it in April, you don't want to come back in July and cut it down again to get rid of the old dead, the old dead stuff. Because even though it's dead from last year, it's still functioning doing something really important in the environment for our pollinators. And these are the bees that are responsible for doing all the pollination for berries, blueberries, blackberries, I should say, strawberries, fruit trees, so apples, crab apples, plums, and things like that. Next slide, please. I'm going to get to the next ones a little quicker. So pests, again, I mentioned it before, generally as you support the environment and you support the ecosystem, things start to balance out. Pest insects don't really become that much of an issue because if you're maintaining the property the right way, you already have a base population of predators already existing in the garden. So spring comes, sometimes warm spring days, warm late winter days, I can already find jumping spiders jumping around my garden and other types of arthropods, not insects because it's not an insect, jumping around and doing what they need to do to keep pest species under control. I don't even like using the word pest species. Next slide, please. Just a little photo. This is lacewing larvae, and they are nocturnal, so keep your lights off. Put red lights or orange lights out, or put them on sensors. These guys love to eat mosquitoes as adults, and they are voracious predators as larvae also. So they crawl around your plants, and they eat any pest species. Next slide, please. Cooper's hawk, they'll help deal with some mice, any other rodent problems, as well as invasive birds such as sparrows and starlings they like to target as well. Next slide, please. And these are just photos from people's native gardens on Long Island and the wildlife that they've attracted to them. So Kevin here, he had a plain old English ivy little garden over here when he inherited this house or purchased his house. And then he has since removed all of the invasive species, the English ivy, and replaced it with a beautiful garden of native species here. Half a dozen native species here. You can make out between violets and echinacea and tickseed, swamp milkweed, geraniums. So he's done a really great job at increasing diversity. He went from just one plant, English ivy, to, like I said, about half a dozen different native species supporting all different sorts of native insects and also songbirds. Mineola. So this is Angela. She's one of my customers, one of my clients. She took advantage of the North Hempstead Native Plant Rebate Program that they've been doing the past 2 years. And that's for rain gardens as well, rainwater remediation. And she's replaced her lawn with a beautiful diversity of native plants, and she's doing the same in her backyard. Next slide. I think some of the next slides are actually photos from her garden. So again, you have both male and female monarchs nectaring on the right, and then larvae feeding on seed pods on the left. Next slide again. So two different species of swallowtail butterflies. We have the spicebush swallowtail on the left, who looks like a snake to scare would-be predators, or also looks like Caterpie if you're a fan of Pokemon. And then you have male and female black swallowtail butterflies on their host plant. So these two don't have to leave her garden ever. They have nectar plants, they have hosting plants, they can freely reproduce, and she can have a self-sustaining population of that species just in her own yard without ever having to leave. Next slide. Beautiful chokeberry hedge here. So this is, you want privacy, beautiful flowering shrub. Great, healthy berries if you want to eat them yourself. Otherwise, it's a great habitat for songbirds for the winter. These are robins from last winter when it did snow, providing habitat and resources for these songbirds to overwinter in her garden out east. Next slide, please. We can skip this one. Just a little white-breasted nuthatch in a, we can skip that one too. You can keep going, because if anyone wants to learn more about exactly how to figure out which native plants to utilize in their garden, you can contact me. That's what this slide's about. We'll just get to the end. We'll just skip across. Keep going. So just benefits for people, because we did speak a lot about the benefits for wildlife. Cleaner air, water, and soil through the absence of chemicals, but also through the filtration and absorption of pollutants. The increases the biodiversity, of course, beautification of our communities, and my favorite is it preserves the soundscape. So when I'm out in my garden and the wind's blowing, you can hear the branches and the grasses, the blades of grasses on each other, the raindrops on the leaves, crickets in the summer months where it's night and day between someone's lawnscape and my garden because it's full of insects that are singing versus someone's who just has nothing. Next slide. And then, of course, it's just a great learning opportunity for children and adults alike. Besides wildlife, people need nature. So adding native plants in your property, in your garden, is only going to beautify your property, only going to, give you that access to nature that we're just lacking on our daily life. Throughout daily life, we just don't have that access anymore. And one last slide, just a thank you to everyone here. Again, thank you for having me. Thank you for joining us if you're in person or online. We mentioned earlier, I am secretary for the Long Island Native Plant Initiative. If you have the time, Wednesdays and Saturdays, we do have volunteer days. If you are looking for native plants, you can contact me anytime. My website is provided by the Ethical Humanist Society, and I'm down in Malvern every Saturday, starting in April, selling native plants for anybody who may need some native plants. All right, thank you very much, everyone. Hand it back over to you.